Hi everyone, so if you're a regular viewer of this channel, you might be experiencing a little deja vu right now. Yes, this is an old video. The original version of this video kept getting copyright claimed for some inexplicable reason, even though it's obviously fair use since this is criticism, since this is a critique of a film. So I've made a few edits here and there to the video in the hopes of preventing it from being claimed again. So if some of the clips of the film seem like they're flipped upside down or sideways or otherwise inverted, that's why. And if you see any other odd bits of editing, that's probably the reason as well. Okay, that's it. That's all. On to the video. Hey everyone. So Halloween is coming up, and I thought that it would be a good idea to do a video diving into a horror film. But there's a little problem, which is I'm just not a big fan of the horror genre. Now, I don't think it's a quality thing. I don't think there's anything intrinsically wrong with horror films of any variety. But I just often feel personally that I just can't connect with them. Or worse, I often feel kind of like turned off by them on a visceral level. I think what it comes down to is basically I'm a coward. Basically, I'm not a person who enjoys being scared. And I'm particularly not a person who likes jump scares or plots that are mostly contingent on trying to figure out which character will be viciously slaughtered first, or kind of spending all of your time just hoping and praying that your favorite character doesn't take an axe in the back. That's just not really the kind of cinematic experience that I enjoy. But even with my irrational prejudice against the genre, there's actually one horror film that I consider among not only the greatest films ever made, but among the most beautiful films ever made. And that's Masaki Kobayashi's 1964 film, Kwaidan. And I'm going to apologize up front here because I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'm probably going to pronounce it Kwaidan throughout the course of this video. But frankly, before recording, I tried to look up the correct pronunciation and found multiple conflicting videos and multiple conflicting reports. In fact, I watched a video where Guillermo del Toro was talking about his love of the film, and he managed to pronounce the title two different ways over the course of like 35 seconds.
Well, Kwaidan by Masaki Kobayashi is a crucial film. The stories are based on a book of his called Kwaidan. Kwaidan.
So I'm going to call it Kwaidan if you're a native Japanese speaker or just somebody who is a little bit more proficient in film history than I am, and I am butchering the name. I apologize. I'm sorry, but we all have to live with our limitations. We all have to do the best within our limited knowledge and ability, I guess. Anyway, let's talk about Kwaidan. So Kwaidan is a horror anthology film, which alone kind of sets it apart since it was made in 1964 before the horror anthology became a kind of midnight movie staple. So the film doesn't just consist of a single narrative. Instead, it's made up of 4 separate segments, and each of these segments is an adaptation of a different Japanese ghost story. The film's first segment is called The Black Hair, and it tells the story of a poor samurai who abandons his wife and leaves his home in order to remarry into a wealthy family and to work under a wealthier master. Eventually, he just becomes completely consumed by guilt and haunted by the memory of this wife who he left behind. And his new marriage doesn't go well because he's so cold and distant and fixated on the past. And without spoiling too much, he eventually becomes so consumed by regret that he abandons his new wife and returns to the ruins of his old home to try to reconcile with the woman that he abandoned, the woman that he left behind. And yeah, it doesn't exactly go to plan. The second segment in the anthology is called The Woman of the Snow, and it tells the story of a young woodcutter who gets stranded with his older master in a blizzard and ends up having to camp out in this tiny little shack in the woods. In the middle of the night, he wakes up to see this ghostly looking woman dressed entirely in white with pale skin standing over his master, breathing on him this cold breath that just seems to suck and steal the life directly from him. And then the woman turns to him, and she's about to do the same thing to him, but she pauses, and she decides to take pity on him and allow him to live. But she forces him to promise that he will never tell the story of his encounter to anyone ever again. And she says if he ever breaks his promise, she will return and take his life. And it's at this point that the story takes kind of an unexpected twist, because after he returns home and recuperates, the woman actually returns to him in the form of a young traveler. And she essentially seduces him and convinces him to marry her without ever revealing to him her true identity, even though we, as the audience, can intuit it fairly easily. And the second half of this vignette is actually dedicated in some ways to exploring their relationship together, their life together as a married couple, and where that goes. Now, the third vignette is called Hoichi the Earless, and it follows its titular character, Hoichi, who is a blind monk who has just joined a new monastery by the seashore. And Hoichi just happens to be an incredibly talented musician and storyteller. And also, perhaps purely by coincidence, this monastery that he's recently joined is very near to the site of an ancient naval battle from hundreds of years before, where one historic Japanese clan annihilated another in the midst of a particularly bloody conflict. And so Hoichi is unknowingly approached by the ghost of one of the warriors who was killed in this battle and lured away from the monastery and convinced to perform a ballad depicting the events of that great historic battle to the ghosts of all of the warriors and royalty who were killed in the battle. And these specters of fallen soldiers and nobility love his version of the ballad so much that night after night they come back and they drag him away again and convince him to go again and again and again to perform this ballad for them. And so as Hoichi falls more and more under the spell of these ghosts, the other monks in the monastery realize that something is up and try to concoct a plan to free Hoichi from these otherworldly influences. And the final vignette in the anthology is called In a Cup of Tea. And this is an interesting one. This is one that is, in terms of plot and in terms of style, very different from the other three. So this story is framed explicitly as an unfinished tale. So we're told right at the beginning of this vignette that it's not going to have a satisfying conclusion, that it's not going to be all wrapped up for us. And instead, we get a very bizarre story about a samurai who pours himself a glass of tea and sees the reflection of another man in that glass of tea, a man who is nowhere to be seen in the real world, in the world surrounding him. Here's a man entirely alone who pours himself a cup of tea and sees a totally different human being's reflection in it. And so he throws out that cup of tea and pours himself another one. And sure enough, this man's reflection is back in the second cup of tea. And he throws that cup of tea away and pours a third one. And once again, there's the man's reflection. There's the man staring back at him from within the tea in the teacup. And so ultimately, this guy is like the hell with it, and he drinks the cup of tea. And as a result, he may or may not have consumed the soul of this ghostly man in the process. And then the entire story spirals out from there. The entire story is an exploration of the consequences of that decision. And once again, without spoiling too much, that story ends in a very modern and very meta way that's also deeply frightening, I think. Okay, so now that I've given you a brief overview of the film, we can finally ask the question, what is it that makes it such a beautiful work of cinematic art? And, well, first of all, just on a very superficial level, this is an absolutely gorgeous movie to look at. This film is visually stunning. It's funny because we don't usually think of horror films as being beautiful. At least I know I don't. And when we do talk about beauty in horror, we're often talking about a kind of grotesque beauty. You know, the beauty of the macabre, or something like, as I mentioned at the top, maybe something like Guillermo del Toro, where many of the things he creates in his films, the creatures and the settings, are beautiful insofar as they're ghastly, memorable more for just how viscerally terrifying they are and unnerving they are than for how beautiful they are in any conventional sense. But that's not really the kind of beauty that I'm talking about here. This isn't a film that is so ugly in such a unique way that it passes beyond the realms of ugliness and it transcends ugliness and becomes a work of beauty. No, this is a visually appealing, gorgeous film on its surface. And a big part of that is Kobayashi's use of color. And that's also kind of a weird compliment to give a horror film. You don't hear about many horror films being praised for their use of color. In fact, often films that are trying to be scary will intentionally dial back their palette, will intentionally stick to either black and white and gray, or to kind of washed out colors, you know, like pale green or kind of swampy, muddy colors. And there's a reason for that. There's a whole host of reasons for that. I mean, obviously, we on a visceral level, on a primordial level, human beings are scared of the dark. We have a natural and innate fear of what we cannot see. And many horror films use that fear to great effect. And so keeping the ghost or the monster or the demon or the serial killer out of sight, keeping them in shots that are dimly lit, that are mostly full of darkness, just is just like intrinsically effective at making them scarier, at enhancing the audience's fear. And likewise, washed out, muddy colors are often intrinsically linked to ideas that we have about disease or corruption or contamination. You know, the colors of infection and gangrene and spoiled meat and human waste. These are all things that we have inherent knee-jerk biological fear reactions to, too, for good reason, because nobody wants to eat contaminated or spoiled food. You know, nobody wants to have an infected digit or limb. These are things that in the natural world mean sickness or death, or at least a dramatic decrease in your quality of life. But Kwaidan does not use that color palette at all. Kwaidan is not a film full of muddy browns and sickly greens, and it's not even a film that's too consumed by darkness. Although the color black does play a pretty critical role, especially in the first segment. I mean, it's even in the title of the first vignette. But black is only one of a very wide range of vivid colors that Kobayashi uses in this film. You have shots that feature just brilliant, bright, flaming red backdrops. You have pinks, you have greens, you have blues, you have white, especially in The Woman of the Snow. White in that segment is in some ways a more terrifying color than black. And terrifying is right, because even though this is a film that's full of bright, vivid colors, those colors don't detract from its power as a horror film. In fact, those colors in many ways enhance its ability to unnerve and frighten the viewer. And this is accomplished in no small part through Kobayashi's use of theatrical painted backdrops instead of more organic backgrounds and more organic skies. And just to clarify what I mean by this is a phenomenon that you actually see in a lot of older films. If you look closely, you'll notice that classic films, especially films from the 30s and 40s, have a tendency to use painted backdrops like theatrical sets rather than taking a camera outside and filming in an open, natural location, in a real location. So instead of seeing actual real skies, you'll see painted skies. Instead of having an actual cityscape in the background, there'll be a painted cityscape. There'll be a background that's very clearly a large canvas set up in the back of the shot. But anyway, Kwaidan is filled with these painted backdrops. And in fact, often there's no attempt to make them look like they're actual, natural, real-world skies or real-world locations. There's no real attempt to make them look authentic and real. Instead, Kobayashi really leans into making these backdrops look as otherworldly and supernatural as possible. One of the greatest examples of this is in the beginning of The Woman of the Snow, during the blizzard scene. The sky during that blizzard, the way it changes colors, the way that it looks like no earthly sky, no sky you would encounter in the real earthly world, not even in the midst of a cataclysmic snowstorm. It's just immediately jarring, and it immediately lets the audience know that something otherworldly, something supernatural is taking place. And in fact, as that sequence goes on, you begin to see eyes in those painted backdrops. You begin to see eyes painted into the sky. And those eyes actually become a reoccurring motif throughout that section. And they're greatly associated with the woman herself, the ghostly woman who materializes out of the blizzard, who has this kind of supernatural power to freeze men with her breath. And in fact, the film seems to use these backdrops to indicate that characters, and indeed maybe the audience themselves, have passed out of this world, this material world that we know, and into the spirit world. Because the film especially loves to use its most extreme painted backdrops in sequences where characters are in contact with that spirit world, in contact with either another reality or in contact with spirits and beings that have come from that other reality. In fact, the use of these backdrops is somewhat subdued in the first vignette in the series within the black hair. It does occur in a few instances, but the colors used in these backdrops are often more subdued during that segment, and the scenes depicted are somewhat more realistic. So it's easier to miss the fact that the film is using these artificial backgrounds within that first segment. And it's fitting because there's not much supernatural going on for the first 3/4 or so of the black hair. This is a more mundane story, at least at its start. It's not a creepy ghost story right from the drop, and the use of backgrounds and the use of color reflects that. But then in the second section, in The Woman of the Snow, in the section where the supernatural entity appears from minute one, or almost from minute one, and persists to have a dramatic presence throughout the entirety of the story, we see these backdrops in their most extreme form from the very first shot, from the very beginning of this vignette. And they persist throughout. And in fact, in the moments of real intimacy between this young lumberjack and this woman who he's fallen in love with, who he doesn't know is the ghostly entity who he encountered in the middle of that blizzard, the sky constantly gives away what's going on. In fact, even after he's left the blizzard itself and the physical and spiritual threat to his well-being that it represents, the skies are still super duper weird. And these skies are so weird because the ghost, or the supernatural entity, has never actually left the story. She's still there as his lover and his companion. And even as he's absorbed in his romantic feelings for her, we as the audience can see the sky and we can see that something unnatural is going on. And in fact, there's a great moment during the romantic montage of these two characters bonding, where we as the audience can very clearly see one of those big, scary eyes in the sky from the beginning, from the blizzard, materialize in a spot where the woodcutter cannot see, within our protagonist's blind spot, really. And it's this chilling moment, and it's wonderful because this is superficially this deeply romantic scene, but there's this fucking eye right there, and we are creeped out while we watch this. It doesn't feel right. Regardless of the puppy love scenario playing out on screen, we can see that the darkness and maybe the evil, or at least the otherworldly elements, are still present, and that this poor guy is still facing a supernatural threat that he doesn't even recognize. And then in Hoichi, the use of these backdrops is maybe even more significant and maybe even more dramatic. Actually, at the beginning of the story, we're presented with a dramatic and lengthy battle sequence where we watch this historical conflict play out. And this battle scene really drops all pretense that it's taking place in anything resembling our real world. For one thing, the backdrops return, and the skies in the sequence are just absolutely bright red. And even beyond that, this is superficially a battle that's taking place on open water out in the ocean, but it's very clearly not actually filmed on the ocean. It's presented almost as if we're watching a film version of a stage play. There's all this artificial mist, artificial smoke rising up off the water, and we get no sense of the depth or scale of this water. We don't get the sense of an open ocean or an open sea. Instead, it actually feels fairly claustrophobic. You very much get the sense of this taking place within a false and artificial and staged, and like I said before, theatrical setting. And the costuming and performances too are very theatrical, very almost kabuki in their presentation. And not only that, but these battle reenactments are intercut with pictures of artwork, pictures of historical, traditional Japanese art depicting this same battle. And so all of these artificial touches work together to give the sense not of us watching an actual battle that took place in some historical moment, but instead it feels more like we're watching Hoichi's ballad, his story, his retelling of this battle from within the theater of our own imagination. This feels like a scene that's very much intended to depict not the world as it was, but the world as we imagine it, as we're being told a tall tale or a ghost story. And obviously that perfectly overlaps with what's going on thematically, where we're being presented with a story about a storyteller. And even though this section is very clearly false on some level, it's also absolutely fucking gorgeous. It is a vivid and beautifully costumed and choreographed and shot sequence. And yeah, that same use of color, those same use of backdrops reoccur throughout Hoichi's story, especially when he's in the presence of the spirits, especially when he's in the presence of the ghosts. But this segment does something interesting because it also includes several scenes that are shot on the actual seashore, that are shot on the beach, on a real beach. There's a funeral scene where an individual who has allegedly been lured out into the ocean and drowned by the ghosts is buried at sea. And this is a real burial at sea. I mean, they're not actually burying a real human being at sea, but it's a real raft being set adrift on a real ocean, into a real sea. And there's another sequence where Hoichi is standing on some cliffs overlooking what's very clearly the actual honest-to-goodness ocean. And so you have the incorporation of real settings, real world locations within this story that has all of these obviously fanciful and fantastical locales and sets. And you might wonder, well, why is Kobayashi doing this? Like, why has he made this stylistic choice? And I think one reason for it is it heightens the contrast between the mundane, real world that these characters live in, and once again, as I said before, the spiritual, otherworldly reality occupied by these phantoms and these ghosts. And having that contrast there, having these glimpses of a real world, make us feel more intensely the weirdness and the horror of these other less real feeling, more unnatural and supernatural settings. And so this contrast becomes a way to inject some horror into this horror movie. And it injects this horror on an almost subconscious level. Because even if we're not consciously going from scene to scene saying, oh, okay, this scene was definitely shot on location out in the real world, and this scene was obviously shot on a set with a fake backdrop, our brain is subconsciously registering that something is off here. Because we get that these two realities don't fit cleanly together. We're willing to accept a film that feels 100% fake. We're willing to suspend disbelief if we're watching a movie and from the first scene it's obvious that everything was shot, on a set on a backlot somewhere. And likewise, we're willing to accept the idea of a quasi-documentary film where everything's shot on location. But when we start to see different styles interacting with each other and clashing with each other, that creates cognitive dissonance. That creates a sense of uneasiness deep within us. And this film, and especially this section of the film, plays beautifully with that unease. And the final vignette, In a Cup of Tea, does something really weird. And it's something that I actually found kind of off-putting the first time that I watched this film. And this was initially maybe my least favorite of the 4 segments because of this. And the thing I'm dancing around is it removes the painted backdrops either entirely or almost entirely. And it dials the color palette for the most part way back and way down. And you get a sequence that's much more gray, much more pale, and much more reserved in its use of color, in the elaborateness and intricacy of its sets, in its costuming in many ways, except for one critical scene late in the sequence where you actually do get a trio of characters who are dressed in very colorful outfits. But yeah, there's this overwhelming sense that the color has been sucked out of this film, that some of the romantic excess of this film has been drained away in this final sequence. And so since what initially struck me so much about this film was its visual beauty, I watched In a Cup of Tea and I said, oh, I wish there was more going on here visually. But I actually think this is an intentional and very effective stylistic choice. Now, I have to be very careful here, and in fact, I'm going to issue a very mild spoiler warning for the end of the film. If you haven't watched this film yet, go watch it. It's an absolute masterpiece. It's better than some dude's YouTube video. So, anyway, the film ends on a very meta note. The last big scare of the film plays very heavily with the idea that you have just been watching a series of ghost stories in every sense of the word, that you've been watching a film about storytelling. So the final scare of the film deals with the rupturing of the barrier between the storyteller and the story that's being told, between the reality of the film and the reality of these stories, these narratives, and the reality that exists outside of these stories, and maybe even outside the film itself. And so, with that in mind, I think an intentional stylistic choice was made here. I think Kobayashi chose to keep this segment more subdued in its color palette, more subdued in its costuming, more subdued in its sets and presentation, exactly so that the audience would feel like they're being lured back into the real world, lured back into the mundane world that they inhabit, and out of that ghostly spirit world that kept popping up throughout the other segments of the film. And once we're lured into believing that, oh, this is something that more closely resembles reality, the distance between us as a viewer and the reality presented in the film becomes less and less. We start to feel on some level like, oh, okay, now we're back in the real world. Now maybe we're back in the space where these ghosts and these spirits and these phantoms can't touch us. And then, of course, at the end of the film, that world finds a way to touch ours. And we're left with this palpable sense of terror. And I do think terror because I do feel like the final scare of the film, without giving it away, was one of the scariest ones for me. But we're left with this palpable sense of terror because we no longer feel like there's this safe distance between the scary world of the film that we were watching and the safe world, the safe, mundane, simple, real, concrete world that we all occupy. And so, yeah, it freaks us out. Okay, so by now you probably get the fact that I think that this is a visually beautiful film. But you know what? I think it's also a thematically and emotionally beautiful film as well. This is a horror movie that manages to have real depth to the way it explores human lives and human minds and human emotions, and depth that goes beyond just the scares it provides. But it's still a really scary movie. I don't want to downplay or underplay that. At the end of the day, this is a deeply unsettling and legitimately horrifying film to watch. It's more the way that the film comes by its scares that's unique. The way the film frightens us, the way it disturbs us, the way it makes us feel uncomfortable, ill at ease, the way it makes us tense, the techniques it uses to make us legitimately horrified, are, I think, rather different than those used by a lot of horror films. For one thing, this is a movie with almost no jump scares. There are a total of 2 moments in this film that could be considered jump scares in the traditional sense, where the camera suddenly cuts to a scary sight or something shocking that we weren't expecting. And in both of those instances, those jump scares are not really preceded by the kind of rapid, aggressive, and arguably manipulative editing that you often see in horror films. You know, the like, she's right behind you kind of shots. Instead, both of these shots, even though I think they are arguably jump scares, are heavily foreshadowed. And there's a lot of cold and meticulous build up to them. And both feel entirely natural and entirely earned. But more than that, I'm only talking about 2 scenes in a 3-hour movie here. 2 shots in a movie that is over 3 hours long. In a movie that has 4 different complete stories. So how does a film that has only 2 jump scares in its entire runtime manage to remain consistently unnerving, consistently scary, consistently terrifying throughout? Well, it does it by actually grappling with and actually addressing the things that truly frighten us on a deep psychological and human level. Things like guilt and death and loss and regret and, yes, the fear of the unknown, the fear of the prospect of coming into contact with something supernatural or otherworldly, something that we can't comprehend, can't understand, can't even perhaps process. And each of the different segments actually has a very different approach to eliciting fear and discomfort from the viewer. The black hair, for example, actually takes quite a long time before even arriving at its ghost, before arriving at anything supernatural. As I said before, the first 2/3 of this vignette is really just about this samurai becoming increasingly consumed with guilt, increasingly consumed with regret. And because it's willing to take the time to explore his feelings, because it's willing to force us to sit with a real human being while they grapple with the consequences of a choice that they made. A choice with real moral ramifications, with real human ramifications. We get sucked into his perspective and we start to feel that guilt. We start to feel the anguish that he feels over the choice that he made, and we start to long for the same kind of reconciliation that he's longing for. And that's important because the supernatural payoff at the end of this story, which I won't spoil in this video anyway, would not have the same impact if we hadn't really begun to feel his longing and really begun to hope for a moment of real reconciliation. If we didn't share his desire for a second chance, for an opportunity to set right the mistakes of the past, the ending of this vignette just wouldn't work in the same way for us. It just would not be as effective. And in fact, it's the way that this story toys with that emotion that we all share, that desire that we all share to be able to right mistakes that we've made in the past, that fantasy we all have about going back and undoing our mistakes, going back to the past and righting wrongs and correcting things and putting ourselves back on the right path. If we didn't all share that same universal longing, this story wouldn't work. But we do all share that same universal longing. We do all secretly yearn for that. And because that's something that we all secretly want and we all secretly wish we could do, the payoff of this story is unsettling for us, has deep emotional power, has deep, dark emotional power, because we're watching that desire of our hearts be frustrated, be subverted, be turned inside out and upside down as well. And so, like all great myth, like all great folklore, like all great ghost stories, this connects to our real lived psychological experience in a profound way. I don't want to spoil, even on an emotional level, all of these different stories. I do want you to sit down and watch the film if you haven't already. But out of all 4 segments, I think my favorite is The Woman of the Snow. And what I love about this story on an emotional level, on a thematic level, is how throughout it tantalizes you with exactly the threat that you expect from a ghost story, i.e., eventually this man is going to reveal his secret to the world, and this ghost woman is going to murder him, right? That's kind of what we expect. And in fact, the story very much sets us up with that expectation. That's the opening hook. The opening hook is, if you tell the world my secret, I will kill you. Now, okay, just turn off the video right now if you don't want me to spoil The Woman of the Snow. Okay, you had your chance. I'm going to spoil it now. All right, so that story does not end with her killing him at all. He does reveal his secret. He does tell the story of his encounter with the ghostly woman on that night in the blizzard. But he tells this story within a context that's deeply ironic, because he tells the story to the woman herself after she's married him. And not only after she's married him, but after she's had children with him. So they've lived this life, this decade of like shared domestic bliss. They've made a family together. And then he catches sight of her in just the right light, in just the right moment. And she reminds him of the woman he saw, the ghostly spirit that he encountered that night in the forest so many years ago. And because he loves her so much, and because he's so wrapped up in this moment of realization, he tells this woman, who he believes is just his wife and the mother of his children, this story for the first time. And of course, he's actually telling this story to the ghost, to the spirit that he encountered. And the way she handles it is, on the one hand, so unlike what you would possibly expect, and on the other hand, so brilliant and so profound. So what would you think would happen? I mean, so in this moment, there's a thing you're afraid is going to happen, and there's a thing that your like heart and soul wants to happen. Well, there's a thing that like your humanity is crying out for in this situation. So obviously the thing that you're afraid will happen is she's going to walk over, she's going to exhale this white breath on him, and he's going to fall over dead. And the thing you're hoping will happen is that she'll forgive him, that she'll understand the emotion underlying, the love underlying his decision to tell her and only her this story. But no, neither of these expected or hoped for conclusions happens. Instead, she gets up, she confronts him, she tells him to never tell this story to anyone again. She tells him she won't kill him for the sake of their children, and then she just leaves him. She just walks back out into the snow, and we see that big eye in the sky again as she disappears. And that's it. And he's just left alone with the children, left alone with the memory of this beautiful love that he once had. And he's just, in this one moment, both lost the love of his life and been made to realize that he's just spent the last 10 years married to something supernatural, to something ghostly or demonic or otherworldly. And he's just left with the profound emotional weight of this reality, and also with the deep guilt and regret for having said anything at all, for having broken this promise and told this story. And it's wonderful because as a conclusion, it's simultaneously incredibly modern in the way that it totally subverts the audience's expectations, and in the way that it deals with really complex and conflicted human emotions. But it's also deeply mythic. It also still feels like a true ghost story, like a true piece of folklore. Because we often associate ghost stories with these moments of tragic irony, these moments where the story comes full circle and there's this deep, dark twist, this kind of weird moment of karmic comeuppance. And it's also really fucking scary. And it's scary for much the same reason that the black hair is scary, because it touches on real human fears, real human anxieties, real human emotion. Like, it touches on the fear that we all have of losing a loved one, of being abandoned, of having to become a single parent, of being separated permanently from a spouse or from a family member. And it deals also with the horror of death and with the question of, would you rather die or lose the person you love the most in the world? And it does it in a way that's completely unique and that's wonderfully complicated, that wonderfully refuses to be simple in its calculations, that avoids the cliches of slasher films and of ghost films and of monster flicks. It's just the basic, complicated and conflicted terror of having to live in a world where nothing is permanent, where you could lose anything at any moment, no matter how much you love it, no matter how much you care for it, and that you might be culpable, that you might be responsible for that loss, even though you never intended to be, even through an act that seems completely insignificant, even through an act made out of love itself. And Christ, that's scary. And yeah, I think that's it. I think that's it. I think I'm done. Thank you for bearing with me here. Thank you for listening. I know I kind of went off there. I know this is probably going to end up being a fairly long video. So what I'm hoping to do next is I am hoping to do a second video on Kwaidan. And I'm hoping, fingers crossed, to get it out just in time for Halloween. So stay tuned for that. And of course, thank you. Thank you for watching. Thank you for sticking with me here. I hope my voice didn't sound too super weird in this video. I'm just getting over a cold that I've been struggling with for a couple weeks. So if my voice sounds weird or funny, I apologize. Anyway, thank you so much. Thank you for watching. Please, if you have it in your heart, if you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe. Maybe hit that bell icon to be notified of future videos. And yeah, I really appreciate everyone who's stuck with me through all of my videos so far. I really appreciate all the kind and supportive and deeply insightful comments that different people have left. And I'm just rambling at this point. So that's it. Happy Halloween. I'll see you in the next video.